I really like film photography because, one, the aesthetic reason for it. I also like the fact that a lot of people historically have used it, so it helps you maintain a connection with people in the past who've done it.
Welcome all to Drawing with Light, a series discussing the past and present of analog photography. From the very first photos ever made to your hipster friend who buys a camera at every Goodwill he visits, this show will take you through it all. So dig out your grandma's camera from the attic and grab a chemistry textbook because we are diving into the developer and telling the great story of photography. I'm your host, Elliot Payne, and this is episode 3, where we'll discuss how film photography died and became not dead in the 2010s. We'll discuss how, against all odds, analog photography became a bright new scene for a whole new generation of artists across the world. I'm joined today by an expert in this resurgence of analog photography, Noah Henderson. So starting off, Noah, can you tell us about how you got into this part of the internet?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Noah, and I run the YouTube channel Analog Resurgence, which I started back at the end of 2018, so just over 3.5 years ago at this point.
As far as videos from Analog Resurgence, Noah's channel, are concerned, I found Noah's videos fairly quickly looking up what is a 620 film, what is a 120 film, what is a 110 film, back way back when I was getting started, just trying to figure out where everything is. I think it's great that Noah has a channel that's just about education, just about letting people know what is going on and all that, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we started off this episode with a cold open from my good friend and fellow photographer, Aaron Thomas, explaining how he got into film photography and why it's meaningful to him. This episode is going to cover that strange and beautiful new surge of young people like Aaron and myself who have taken up the film journey amidst a digital era. So, in that topic of today, we first have to ask, how did photography decline, and how did that impact the companies that were making film and in the business at the time?
Man, I think about it a lot because so much of that predates myself and a lot of people who are shooting film now. But I think the early 2000s was such an awkward time for that kind of changeover because so many industries started switching over. And I think, you can point to a lot of amateurs and hobbyists and stuff continuing to do it or experimenting with digital and stuff. But really, I think a big shift is when major industries start changing over, magazine, fashion photography, military, aerial use photography and stuff like that. Things that are really specialized. And when massive sources of income for film manufacturing companies stop being there, then it becomes a bit of a problem, right?
Yeah, and I think we've seen that especially with films and products that have had some pretty big crossover between the industrial and the artistic. There might have been a slight uptick in the artist scene, but not nearly that same popularity among industrial use.
Yeah, and it's also it's difficult because we're always looking at things in kind of a vacuum, right? If you're in the film community and you're looking at other people in the film community, then it just seems like these numbers are growing, but we never really get a clear sense of what the numbers are on a really big scale, which is probably what people like Fuji have to look towards.
So we've established photography declines, at least analog photography, and mid-2000s it's at its lowest point. What sort of influenced the resurgence that we began to see in the 2010s? What were the films and the cameras looking like at this time that led to people wanting to get back into it?
Well, as everything kind of came out of Kodak being bankrupt and Polaroid shutting things down, originally, you go into the 2010s, and at least from my recollection of getting into film just around 2014-ish, things were cheaper. And you were more likely to be able to just come across film cameras and pick things up for prices that have drastically increased over the last 5 years, especially. But there's definitely still the passionate amount of people who never dropped off of it and have continued to use it throughout that. But really, the big part of it is a newfound kind of audience that are coming into it, which I mean, speaks kind of to, especially within a younger demographic of people in, their 20s and like their teens even, it's something that they've kind of gravitated towards because it's maybe just so different from what we have been raised on and like grown up around, because there's so much digital everywhere that, it's not uncommon or like unexpected
Mhm.
to suddenly want to experience or like experiment with something very, very different from like the norm. And you compare
Mhm.
that to people who had to use film all their life and then digital came along and they're like, I would never go back to film. And I'm
Mhm.
like, if I was in that situation, I probably wouldn't necessarily want to go back to film, like for
Mhm.
the same reasons, because it's like, well, this is so much different and like so much more convenient in certain ways and better objectively.
I have a friend whose dad is to this day still a photographer, and but he was also a photographer during the age of film, and he's got a Hasselblad, a Mamiya 7, like a really really nice high quality cameras,
Yeah.
and he's basically passed them all to his son to use since he's gotten into it. And my friend, and I've talked to my friend about it. Like, does he ever does he ever shoot the Hasselblad? And he's like, no, he doesn't. He doesn't care about it. He always shoots digital. And I, in my having never lived in a film era, can't imagine having cameras of that quality and not ever shooting them. It's foreign to me because it seems like
Yeah.
film's so much better and so much more interesting.
It is such a different perspective, right? Because it's like they did it, like, and especially if you're like a pro, like a professional, like working photographer,
Mhm.
during that time, like you've done it.
Now, we've talked about the landscape of the photography world from then to now, but I'd like to get a little bit personal and discuss what got you into analog mediums and, what does that mean to you and why do you choose to get into that?
For myself, in terms of film and like what's drawn me into it, a lot of it originally, it was when I grew up, my dad, we would every so often like watch 8 millimeter and like Super 8 stuff projected, which is a little anachronistic at the time as well, even for my
Mm-hmm.
dad, who was born in the mid 60s, because it was slowly on its way out as he was getting older, anyways. But when I was in high school, I think I came across like a Super 8 camera, which is what a lot of people do. Like, uh,
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely people out there who are looking to buy Super 8 cameras, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel in a lot of instances, people who get into it are just people who find a Super 8 camera
The
in a
cameras find
box.
you more than you find the
Yeah.
cameras.
So I had snagged a camera that is nothing particularly special, but in doing a bit of research coming out of high school and then going to college in Toronto, realizing that there are film labs in Toronto. Primarily, there's like very importantly, there's Niagara's motion picture lab is in Toronto, and that's a resource that exists almost nowhere else in
Mm-hmm.
Canada. There are other motion picture resources for sure, but not a lab like Niagara. So, I had that kind of like as an interest. And then when I was in school, they were essentially like, we've cut film from the curriculum. Like, it's not important at all. And we're going to be focused solely on digital. There was one cinematography teacher in my third year who kind of like on his own, like brought in his film stuff. And like, he does a lot of like really cool work just on his own and just like teaches on the side for this.
Mm-hmm.
So he brought in like his stuff and talked about film and everything. And then from there, I got to do some work at Niagara's lab, which was very interesting. And then coming out of there, like, I picked up like some hand developing experience and like some little stuff too. And just by proxy, kind of got into
Mm-hmm.
experimenting with like just photography stuff, like 35 millimeter and a little more casually. But ultimately, like the motion picture side of things is what my big interest is in.
Mm-hmm.
But it is so expensive on just like an
Mm-hmm.
individual and kind of like, on a whim kind
Yeah.
of scale, that it's, if I want to explore film and learn more and do more stuff, then it's kind of limiting to be like, well, I'm only gonna, really like pay attention to like the cinema side of
Mm-hmm.
things. But yeah, and then coming out of like Niagara and doing some work at Downtown Camera's lab, then I was just like thrown into like the world of photography, and I'm just like, there's so much here, and I just got to learn that side of things. So I'm very lucky to have been like involved in working in labs and like working with some incredibly talented, very creative individuals as well. And also just like Toronto has such an incredible community of film resources, from like Niagara's lab to like the camera stores, like Downtown Camera's lab, and Lift, which is the liaison of independent filmmakers of Toronto. Like there's so much in the city that makes a lot of things easier and possible. So I don't think if I wasn't here, I would have been able to like indulge as much of this and explore and like learn as much of this as I have.
And it is a lot about placement and like where you are and who you're with to be able to get into this. So as far as my story is concerned, I was in high school in, I think it was 2018, and my dad came home from visiting my grandparents, his parents, and he had a sack with something inside it, and he put it on the table and said, "Your grandfather wanted you to have this." He apparently, spur of the moment, found it in a box somewhere and decided to think of me. And what was inside was a Kodak Brownie Hawkeye with the flash handle and 2 rolls of film that had expired sometime in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And I picked it up, I looked at it, I figured out how to look through the viewfinder. I was very curious about what it was. I opened it up, there was film inside. Oops. I did not really grasp that concept, that was not a thing you're supposed to do. I walked around, I pressed the shutter, I advanced, I figured out what it was all about. I was very curious, and at some point I put it on a shelf and kind of forgot about it. During that period, I was still interested. I ended up shooting on an Instax camera for a little bit because someone at my high school had it, and I bought it off of her for $20. But what really got me into film photography proper was going back and looking at that camera about a year later and saying, you know what? I'm going to try it. And This was right in August before I started university in 2019. And I looked at a whole lot of YouTube videos. What is 620 film? What is that? I probably ran across some of your videos and figured it all out and started shooting with it. And then I ordered some Ektar from Amazon and probably spent way too much money on it. And that's really where I got started. It's been a meaningful experience, especially to use the Brownie, because I look at family photos and a lot of those are taken on the Brownie. And being able to still use that and bring it to family gatherings, it's been nice because I do feel a greater connection with my family because of that. And I also feel like I'm taking a piece of, my grandfather or whoever it may be with me as I take pictures on film, because it's part of my family, because I'm shooting a Kodak Extralight 10 or a Kodak Brownie Hawkeye. These aren't high-end cameras, but they're everyday cameras, and that's why I'm able to have that connection. This concludes our time to talk about film photography and the resurgence that we've seen in that. To finish things off, Noah, where can you be found on the internet?
I can be found primarily on the YouTube channel. I try and upload usually once a week, and I'm usually pretty good with that. That is just Analog Resurgence on YouTube. I also the channel does have a TikTok that I just throw some smaller stuff on there, and that's just Analog Resurgence as well. And the same, I think, for Twitter. And then my Instagram is just Noah Hender, because I have yet to relabel that as an actual Analog Resurgence Instagram. But yeah.
All right, that's great. Those Instagrams and TikToks, I was looking at the TikToks last night. They're very good.
Well, thank you.
They're very entertaining.
I don't know what that platform's about, but it's a little fun, to make like short form content and stuff that wouldn't have a home on the channel, or condense stuff down and be able to get stuff out in other ways.
That's great. So now that we've gotten through that, I will go ahead and give some of my shout-outs. I want to say thank you all for listening to Drawing with Light. My name is Elliot Payne, and my Instagram and Flickr are both Elliot, Elleoat. As far as the podcast is concerned, our logo is by Charlotte Payne, and the music is by my brother, Rev. emrev.bandcamp.com. Join us again soon as we continue our journey into the history of photography.